Chapter 7. The Worship of God. In this chapter it is said that perennial awareness of the self is the real worship and penance, tapas. The purpose of the worshipping the impersonal Supreme Being is the incessant remembrance of the truth that you are Brahman, because the meditation I am Brahman comprises sacrifice, gift, penance, ritual, prayer, yoga and worship. The only way to overcome obstructions in meditation is to forbid the mind to dwell on them and to introvert it into the self and there witness unconcernedly all that happens. There is no other method. Do not even for a moment lose sight of the self. Fixing the mind on the self or the I abiding in the heart is the perfection of yoga, meditation, wisdom, devotion and worship. Since the Supreme Being abides as the self, constant surrender of the mind by the absorption in the self is said to comprise all forms of worship. Mind controlled, all else is controlled. The mind is itself the life current. So the 6 subtle centers, chakras, are merely mental pictures and are meant for beginners in yoga. We project ourselves into the idols and worship them because we do not understand true inward worship. Knowledge of the self which knows all is knowledge in perfection. Distracted as we are by various thoughts, if we would continuously contemplate the self, which is itself God, this single thought would in due course replace all distraction and would itself ultimately vanish. The pure consciousness that alone finally remains is God. This is liberation. Never to be heedless of one's own all-perfect, pure self is the acumen of yoga, wisdom and all other forms of spiritual practice. Even though the mind wanders restlessly, involved in external matters and so is forgetful of its own self, one should remain alert and remember, the body is not I. Who am I? Enquire in this way and turning the mind backward to its primal state. The enquiry, who am I, is the only method of putting an end to all misery and ushering in supreme beatitude. Whatever may be said and however phrased, this is the old truth in a nutshell. Chapter 8. Liberation, Mukti. This chapter teaches that liberation can indeed be obtained by constant and prolonged meditation on the self in the form of Shivoham, I am Shiva, which means I am Atman, Aham Brahmasmi. The characteristics of Jivan Mukti, liberation in this life, and Videha Mukti, liberation after death, are all described in this chapter. Because the individual self, which is nothing but the mind, has lost the knowledge of its identity with the real self and has enmeshed itself in bondage, its search for the self, its own eternal primal nature, resembles that of a shepherd searching for a lamb which all the time he bears on his own shoulders. However, the self-oblivious ego, even when once made aware of the self, does not get liberation, that is self-realization, on account of the abstraction of long time accumulated mental tendencies. It frequently confuses the body with the self, forgetting that it is itself in truth the self. Long cultivated tendencies can indeed be eradicated only by long continued meditation. I am not the body, the senses, the mind, etc., but I am the self. Therefore, the ego, that is the mind, which is nothing but a bundle of tendencies and which confuses the body with I, should be subdued, and should the supreme liberated state known as self-realization be reached after prolonged devotional worship of the divine self, which is the very being of all the gods. This self-investigation annihilates the mind and itself gets destroyed eventually, just as a stick used to stir the funeral pyre is itself finally burnt. This is the state of liberation. Self, wisdom, knowledge, consciousness, the Absolute, and God denote the same thing. Can a man become a high officer by merely once seeing such an officer? He may become one if he strives and equips himself for the position. Similarly, can the ego, which is in bondage as the mind, become the divine self simply because it has once glimpsed that it is the self? Is this not impossible without the destruction of the mind? Can a beggar become a king by merely visiting a king and declaring himself as king? Similarly, unless the bond of the mind is cut asunder by prolonged and unbroken meditation, I am the Self, the Absolute, it is impossible to attain that transcendental state of bliss, which is identical with the annihilation of the mind. The Self is the Absolute and the Absolute is the Self. The Self is the Absolute alone. That which is covered with husk is paddy. When dehusked, it becomes rice. So also, when under bondage of action, one is the individual self, and when the veil is removed, one shines as the Absolute. Thus proclaim the scriptures, which further declare the mind should be drawn within and restrained in the heart until the ego sense, which sprouts as the ignorant mind, is therein destroyed. This is wisdom and meditation as well. All else is mere lecturing and pedantry. And in consonance with this final word, one should fix the mind on Him, be aware of Him and realize Him by every possible endeavor. Just as a Brahmin actor does not forget that he is a Brahmin, whatever part he may be acting, so also man should not confuse himself with this body, but should have a firm awareness of his being the self, whatever his activity may be. This awareness will manifest as the mind gets absorbed in its own primal state. Such absorption leads to bliss supreme when the self reveals itself spontaneously. Then one will not be affected by pleasure and pain which result from contact with the external objects. Everything will be perceived without attachment, as in a dream. Such thoughts as, is this good or that? Is this to be done or that? Should not be allowed to arise. Immediately a thought arises, it should be annihilated at its source. If entertained even for a little while, it will hurl one down headlong like a treacherous friend. Can the mind, which is fixed in its original state, possess an ego sense or have any problem to solve? Do not such thoughts themselves constitute bondage? Hence, when such thoughts arise due to past tendencies, not only should the mind be curbed and turned back to its true state, but also it should be made to remain unconcerned and indifferent to external happenings. Is it not due to self-forgetfulness that such thoughts arise and cause more and more misery? Though the discriminating thought, I am not the doer, All actions are merely the reactions of the body, senses and mind is an aid for turning the mind back to its primal state. Nevertheless, it is still a thought, but one which is necessary for those minds which are addicted to such thinking. On the other hand, can the mind fixed unswervingly in the Divine Self and remaining unaffected even while engaged in activities, give in such thoughts as I am the body, I am engaged in work, or again to the discriminating thought I am not the doer, these actions are merely reactions of the body, senses and mind? Gradually, one should by all possible means try always to be aware of the self. Everything is achieved if one succeeds in this. Let not the mind be diverted to any other object. One should abide in the self without the sense of being the doer. Even when engaged in work born of destiny, like a madman, have not many devotees achieved much with a detached attitude and firm devotion of this nature? Because the quality of purity, sattva guna, is the real nature of the mind. Clearness like that of the unclouded sky is the characteristics of the mind expanse. Being stirred up by the quality of activity, rajas, the mind becomes restless and influenced by darkness, tamas, manifests as the physical world. The mind thus becoming restless on the one hand and appearing so solid matter on the other, the real is not discerned. Just as fine silk threads cannot be woven with the use of a heavy iron shuttle, or the delicate shades of a work of art be distinguished in the light of a lamp flickering in the wind, so realization of the truth impossible with the mind rendered gross by darkness, tamas, and restless by activity, rajas. Because truth is exceedingly subtle and serene, mind will be cleared of its impurities only by the desireless performance of duties during several births, getting a worthy master, learning from him and incessantly practicing meditation on the Supreme. The transformation of the mind into world of inner matter due to the quality of darkness, tamas, and its restlessness due to the quality of activity, rajas, then only will cease. Then the mind regains its subtlety and composure. The bliss of the self can manifest only in a mind rendered subtle and steady by assiduous meditation. He who experiences that bliss is liberated even while still alive. When the mind is divested of qualities of darkness and activity, that is tamas and rajas, by constant meditation, the bliss of the self will clearly manifest within the subtle mind. Yogis gain omniscience by means of such mind expanse. He alone who has achieved such subtlety of mind and has gained the realization of the self is liberated while still alive. The same state has been described in Ramagita, an ancient Hindu sacred work, as the Brahman beyond attributes, the one universal undifferentiated spirit. He who has attained the unbroken eternal state beyond even that, transcending mind and speech, is called Videha Mukta. That is, when even the aforesaid subtle mind is destroyed, the experience of bliss as such also ceases. He is drowned and dissolved in the formless ocean of bliss and is unaware of anything apart. This is Videha Mukti. There is nothing beyond it. It is the end of all. As one continues to abide as the self, the experience I am the Supreme Spirit grows and becomes natural. The restlessness of the mind and the thought of the world in due course become extinct. Because experience is not possible without the mind, realization takes place with the subtle mind. Since Videhamukti connotes the entire dissolution of even the subtle mind, this state is beyond experience. It is the transcendental state. I am not the body, I am the pure spirit, is the clear and indubitable experience of the Jivan Mukta. Nevertheless, if the mind is not totally destroyed, there is the possibility of his becoming apparently unhappy in his incidental association with objects as ordained by his destiny. He may also appear to be the onlooker as not having realized the unbroken eternal bliss because his mind seems to be agitated. However, the bliss of liberation in life is possible only to the mind made subtle and serene by long continued meditation. Chapter 9 Yoga Ashtanga. In this chapter is described the path of yoga for obtaining self-realization, getting control of the mind through control of breath. For achieving devotion in the form of meditation described in the previous chapter, steps like Yama and Niyama in Ashtanga or Eightfold Yoga explained below are prescribed. These have two forms, one of the nature of yoga and the other of jnana, yoga ashtanga and jnana ashtanga. Control over breath is yoga, elimination of the mind is jnana. Which of these comes more easily to the aspirant depends on his inherent tendencies and maturity. Both lead to the same result, since by control of breath the mind gets controlled, and by elimination of the mind the breath gets controlled. The object of both these methods is the subsidence and elimination of the mind. Yama, Niyama, Asana, Pranayama, Pratyahara, Dharana, Dhyana, Samadhi are the 8 elements of the yoga. Yama, moral self-control, which is necessary preliminary to the yogic path. Niyama, disciplinary observances. Asana, postures. Pranayama, breath control. Pratyahara, withdrawal of the senses from external objects. Dharana, concentrated attention. Dhyana, steady uninterpreted contemplation. And Samadhi is identification of oneself with the Atman. Of these, breath control consists of exhalation, inhalation and retention. While in all the Shastras it is said that exhalation and inhalation should be equal and retention twice their length, in Raja Yoga, retention of breath is 4 times as long as inhalation and twice as long as exhalation. The breath control of Raja Yoga path is superior to other kinds. If this breath control is practiced according to one's capacity, without strain but regularly, the body gets fatigued in a way but becomes still, and the desire to be in a state of bliss gradually arises in the mind. Then pratyahara must be attempted. This unifies the mind and makes it one-pointed so that it does not run after the external objects of name and form. Since the mind that has till now run after externals can rarely withdraw and steady itself, efforts are made to unify and steady it by holding it to a particular aim by following means. Pranava Japa, the incantation of Om and other incantations made mentally, fixing the attention between the eyebrows, concentrating on the tip of the nose, hearing the sounds arising within the ears alternatively. Dharana, concentrated attention, must then be attempted. This means fixing the mind on a center fit for meditation. The heart and Brahmarandra are recommended as fit spots for dharana. The mind is fixed on either of these spots while conceiving of one's personal deity in the form of a flame of light shining there. Thus concentrating, one must meditate that one is not a separate being from one's deity, and that flame of light is the form of one's Atma, the spirit or self. In other words, it is meditation on I am He, Soham. The scripture says that the all-pervasive Brahman itself is shining in the heart as I, the witness of the intellect. If one asks, who am I? Then he, the deity or the Atman, will be found shining, throbbing as I in the lotus of the heart. Practicing this is also meditation and is much better than the I am He, that is Soham meditation. Anyone can practice whatever comes easy to him. By practice of this kind of meditation, one becomes unaware of oneself and what one is doing, and one's mind gets absorbed in this self. The subtle state in which even the pulsation subsides in this state is samadhi. Only one must guard against sleep in this state. Then it will confer supreme bliss. If anyone practices this daily and regularly, God will bless him on the supreme path, on which he will attain perfect peace. As there are elaborate treatises on the elements of Ashtanga Yoga, only as much as is necessary is prescribed here. Anyone who desires to know more must resort to a practicing yogi with experience and learn from him further details. Pranava is incantation of Om with 3.5 units, A, U, Ma, and a half unit of Ma. Of these, A stands for the waking state, the gross body and creation. U stands for the dream state, the subtle body and preservation. Ma stands for deep sleep, the self at rest in sleep, the causal body and dissolution. The half unit of Ma stands for the fourth state, the true state of the I or self. The state beyond this is the state of pure bliss. The fourth state obtained in meditation as one's true state contains within itself A, U, Ma and the half unit, and so is called the state in which all sound forms have subsided. It is also called silent incantation or non-dual incantation, ajapa, which is the essence of all incantations. It is for obtaining this true experience of Om that in the stage of Pratyahara, silent incantation is prescribed. The soul attains conscious immortality through meditating upon that principle, ever shining like the flame of light, possessing the effulgence of light, residing as all-pervading in the midst of the heart lotus, with 8 petals the size of a thumb and described variously as Kailash, Vaikunt and Paramapadam. The seeker is advised to meditate in accordance with the text. The seeker is advised to meditate upon his own self because that flame which is throbbing as I is the self. Of all forms of meditation, Atma Dhyana, meditation on the self, which has just been described, is the best. If that is achieved, there is no need to attempt other forms of meditation because all are included in it. Other forms are advised only to help achieve success in this. The form of meditation one follows will depend on one's maturity of mind. Though the various modes of meditation may appear different, yet they all converge on the same point. There is no need to doubt this. Knowing one's own self is knowing God. Not knowing the nature of him who meditates, but meditating on God as far into one's own self is like measuring one's shadow with one's foot. You go on measuring while the shadow also goes on receding further and further. So say the scriptures. Hence, meditation on the self is the best, because the self alone is the supreme self of all the gods. Chapter 10. Eightfold Path of Knowledge, Jnana Ashtanga. In this chapter is described the Jnana Marga, the path of knowledge, realization that the Supreme is one and indivisible. Detailed description of phrases of Jnana Ashtanga, the eightfold path of knowledge, such as Yama and Niyama, is beyond the scope of this small work. Exhalation in this path means giving up the two aspects of name and form, of body and world. Inhalation means is taking on, grasping the Sat being, Chit, consciousness, Ananda, bliss. Retention of breath is retaining them, that is the Sat, Chit, Ananda, assimilating what has been taken in. Pratyahara is being ever on the vigil that the rejected names and forms do not intrude again into the mind. Dharana is retaining the mind in the heart so that it does not wander by holding firm to the concept already grasped, that is, I am the Sat Chit Ananda Atman, the self which is being, consciousness, bliss. Dhyana, meditation, is steady abidance in Aham Swarupa, in one's true form, which is experienced as I of its own accord, just as when enquiring who am I, by stilling the scarps of a body of 5 sheets. For this kind of pranayama, there is no need of such regulations as asana, postures, etc. One may practice it in any place or time. The primary aim is to fix the mind in the heart at the feet of the Lord, shining as the self, and never forget him. Forgetfulness of the self is the source of all misery. Elders say that such forgetfulness is death to the aspirant. The aim of both kinds of breath control is to remember the self and to still the mind. Therefore, until the mind has subsided in the heart by means of breath control or self-enquiry, regular yogic breath control remains necessary. Further than that, there is no need for it. One may practice the methods of either yoga or jnana, jnana ashtanga or yoga ashtanga, as one chooses. All the scriptures aim at control of the mind, since destruction of the mind is moksha or liberation. Yoga is control of the breath, while the methods of jnana or knowledge is to see everything as a form of truth or as Brahman, the one and indivisible. It depends on a person's maturity which of these two paths will appeal to him. The path of knowledge is like taming an unruly bull by showing it a bundle of grass. That of the yoga is like taming it by beating and yoking it. So say those who know. Fully competent persons reach the goal by controlling the mind established and fixed in the truth of Vedanta, knowing the certainty of the self and seeing their self and everything as Brahman. Those who are less qualified fix the mind in the heart by means of breath control and prolonged meditation on the self. Those who are still less qualified reach higher stages by methods such as breath control. Bearing this in mind, the yoga of the control of mind is classified as the eightfold path of knowledge and of yoga, that is, as Yoga Ashtanga and Jnana Ashtanga. It is enough if breath control is practiced till Kevala Kumbhaka is achieved. Direct experience of samadhi can also be attained by devotion, bhakti, in the form of constant meditation, dhyana. Kevala Kumbhaka with self-enquiry, even without control of inhalation and exhalation, is an aid to this. If that becomes natural to one, it can be practiced at all times, even during worldly activity, and there is no need to seek a special place for it. Whatever a person finds suitable may be practiced. If the mind gradually subsides, it does not matter if other things come and go. In the Bhagavad Gita, Lord Krishna says that the devotee is higher than the yogi and that the means to liberation is bhakti, devotion in the form of continuous or prolonged meditation on the self, which is the sole reality. Therefore, if somehow or other we get the strength to rest the mind perpetually in Him, why worry about other things? Chapter 11. Renunciation, Sannyasa. In this chapter, the entire effacement of thought is said to be the only true sannyasa, renunciation. Sannyasa or renunciation is not the discarding of external things, but of the ego. To such renouncers, there exists no difference between solitude or active life. The Rishi Vasishtha says, just as a man whose mind is preoccupied is not aware of what is in front of him, so also the sage, though engaged in work, is not the doer thereof, because his mind is immersed in the self without the uprising of the ego. Just as a man lying on his bed dreams that he is falling headlong over a precipice, so also the ignorant person whose ego is still present, though engaged in deep meditation in solitude, does not cease to be the doer of all action. Chapter 12. Conclusion. It is within our power to adopt a simple and nutritious diet, and with earnest and incessant endeavor to eradicate the ego, the cause of all misery, by stopping all mental activity born of the ego. Can obsessing thoughts arise without the ego, or can there be illusion apart from such thoughts? Therefore, meditate incessantly upon the self and obtain the supreme bliss of liberation. This indeed is the purport of this work, Vichara Sangraham, that is self-enquiry. Sarvam Sri Ramanarpanamastu.